Alright guys, part C. Part C, final part, and we're talking about the export of Italian neorealism to Africa. Yeah, so let's do it. Let's finish it up. We've got 31 minutes of footage already, so let's give another 10-12 minutes to this particular topic. We are on page 198, and you want to go 3 lines from the top. So this is the third section. You can note that on your course reader, the third section. Let's take a look. Realism. So 3 lines down from the top of 198. Realism then has particular stakes in Africa, which, like Latin America, has been long defined by the images created of it and its people by exploring, conquering, and colonizing Europeans. Right, so this is very important. There was a particular image of the continent generated by people that initially came outside of the continent. Euclid has stated that from the beginning, the major concern of African filmmakers has been to provide a more realistic image of Africa. And you can think back here to the things Biri was saying about that which is unreal and alien, or what he considered to be unreal and alien. Right, a more realistic image of Africa, more realistic than the images provided in films such as King Solomon's Mines from 1937, or any of the numerous ethnographic documentaries. Films shot in West Africa before independence were made by European and North American directors using an imported crew and for their home audiences. Africa served simply as an exotic background. So the continent was completely in the background. Right, and there you could make a little note on the side, and you could say there's like a fetishism to it. And you can explore what that means, right? That Africa is kind of seen for its fetish value, right? And that's all that it is. That's all that it and its people is. It's something to be there in the background. It's this nice, exotic, as it says there, a background, but there's no focus on Africa and its people at all. They just serve in the background. And the African filmmakers, of course, wanted to challenge that. Right, the only exception to this rule, this idea of using Africa simply as an exotic background, the only exception to this rule were the so-called educational documentaries produced by the colonial film units of France, Belgium, and Great Britain, which were shown to non-elite and often illiterate African audiences and designed to shore up colonialism by shaping the practices and ideology of the colonized. So that was the other thing on offer. Nothing great, right? Either the continent was being used as this exotic background, it was used for its fetish value in a sense, and if it wasn't being used for that, there were these essentially propaganda films being made, right? To try to get people to take on imported practices. So nothing positive or good for sure. Right, against these foreign representations of Africa, and in the middle, we still carry on reading, filmmakers desire to create authentic images of a previously hidden regional and national identity. So it's the same story as Italy and Latin America, right? Believe it or not, the camera had never focused its gaze on normal people, ordinary people living in these places. First, it had ignored ordinary Italians, then it had ignored the struggles of ordinary people in Latin America, and just like those two here, it was ignoring ordinary African experiences. So precisely the same thing is happening. Still in the middle of 198, in the collective statement published in Présence Africaine, sorry for the terrible French, after a 1974 seminar meeting in Burkina Faso titled The Role of the African Filmmaker in Rising an Awareness of Black Civilization, We read that film content should grow from African history and literature and reflect African realities. Again, these guys are trying to pivot to telling their own stories. African cinema should nourish our people's reflection on their own destiny by presenting African human, social, and cultural realities. Right? So again, these guys, it was the same problem and the same sensibility as the Italians and the Latin Americans. Precisely the same thing is happening. They're watching these films about the continent. They're saying, my goodness, we don't see ourselves at all in these films. And we want to speak back to that. We want to actually film something that does talk about our experiences, that does look on the ordinary person living in this continent. Right. And so we drop down to the bottom of 198, and now we get to the big name. I've mentioned him a few times in lectures previous, but here he comes, Simben, Usman Simben. Simben's short film Borom Saret, released in 1963, and here you can write, this was the link to Vittorio De Sisa's 1948 film, The Bicycle Thief. If you watch those two films next to each other, you'll find that they are incredibly similar. So there's really a direct link there. Simben's short film Borom Saret, released in 63, 3 years after Senegalese independence from France, was the first film shot by a sub-Saharan African director in Africa. So this guy really is the pioneer. He really is the father, as they say, of African cinema. Considered the father of African cinema, Simben is also the filmmaker most often associated with the development of an authentically African cinematic realism. And you want to put a big circle around that idea of an authentically African cinematic realism, because again, it's the same thing that happens. Yes, inspiration is taken from the Italian Neorealists, but as it enters the African context, just as it did in the Latin American context, it isn't simply a replication, it isn't simply a repetition, it becomes something else altogether when it's mixed in with that, in this instance, Senegalese orientation, right? So again, it transforms itself into something different. The hour-long, now we're jumping over to 199. The hour-long Black Girl appeared in 66. His first long feature in color, Mandabi in 68, and 8 more feature films in the years since then. Simben's early films, like those of the Neorealists and new Latin American filmmakers, was shot with little equipment or funding and without studios, professional actors or actresses, or synchronized sound. Again, same set of problems. Lack of equipment, lack of funding. We're going to do this ourselves. He has consistently represented the everyday lives and problems of ordinary Africans, rejecting classical Hollywood editing and plot resolution. Very, very interesting. So he also makes that decision to not tell clean, neat, linear stories. He's going to do something different. When you watch his films, you'll see there's a different tempo to them. There's a different orientation to them. When you watch a Usman Simben film, you can see that it's not our typical experience of film. Simben has always described himself as a realist filmmaker. He has tried to show the true face of Africa. Again, we have to be fair here. If Simben is saying he's showing the true face of Africa, remember Biri said he was showing true reality, or I can't remember what he called it, but there's this idea of truth. We have to be suspicious. Remember, everybody has a particular, every single person has some sort of ideological disposition or bias. But one thing that is true about Simben is that he has never tried to please his audiences through the embellishment of reality. So Simben is a guy that very often took on very uncomfortable topics and has been in trouble with all sorts of different regimes and governments and so forth. He always looks at uncomfortable topics, topics that, if he's talking about ordinary Africans, he looks at topics that ordinary Africans, or Senegalese in his instance, don't want to look at. Certain practices that they feel very, very uncomfortable with. Okay, let's take a look. And that actually brings to mind a particular film, a South African film. A lot of people are writing about it. Some of my students at Honours and above are writing about it, but I've forgotten the name. It's the one that caused all the controversy. I'm sure you know it. Eba? I don't know. Something like, yeah, I think I'm right. Caused a lot of controversy. It was a very uncomfortable film for a lot of people. People tried to shut cinema houses down here because it dealt with a very uncomfortable question or aspect of South African culture. So Simbene was precisely the same. He wasn't afraid to take on what do you call it? Holy cows in Senegalese culture. So we move to page 200. We're at the bottom of page 200. Neorealism here once again stands for a European cinematic tradition, which should be rejected in the search for an authentic African cinema, national morality, and reality. Simbene has responded to this reproach with the reassertion of his commitment to realism, and moreover by allying himself with the Neorealist project to excavate an often unpleasant reality. It's curious that certain spectators don't want to look reality in the eye. There are, for example, slums in Senegal. The scandal is in their very existence and not in showing them. Right, again, we can take two things from that paragraph. As I was telling you, he's going to deal with very uncomfortable topics. And also, even though he is inspired by Italian neorealism, he doesn't make Italian neorealist films in Africa, right? He's inspired by it, and he takes aspects and elements of it, but as he transposes it to his own reality and context, it becomes something unique, right? So for all these filmmakers, there's this rejection of repetition. There's this celebration of difference. That's what they're looking for. They're trying to do something unique, trying to do something different. And last thing, we take a look at page 202. Right in the middle of page 202, this is the last paragraph we're doing. Right in the middle of 202, Simbene's films are neither style-free nor almost unprofessional. Over the course of his career, he has consistently experimented with the structure of filmic narrative in order to represent a previously hidden African reality in a newly African manner. So he's really thinking about these things and trying to represent them on film. Remember, to think difference, to try to break out of habitual modes of thought is very difficult. And this guy's struggling through it. So it's very admirable, right? African realism, like neorealism in the new Latin American cinema, is a question of style. Simbene has repeatedly described his role as that of a griot, and many critics have traced the ways in which he and other filmmakers have worked to adapt the structures of the African oral tradition. So he's trying to bring that into filmmaking, as difficult as that may be. So again, there's this mix here between Italian neorealism and its techniques, and for example, African culture, or the African oral tradition. And you guys can read on by yourselves. There's a bit more information about Simbene if you do have the time or inclination, and specifically if you're lucky enough to have the cap for it, I do encourage you to check out some of his films. Right, so in sum, we talked a little bit more part A about Italian neorealism and this question of reality and what they're up to, these claims to truth. B, we looked at its export to Latin America, and this part C, we looked at the export to Africa. And that really means we finished with Italian neorealism. The next lecture, lecture 11, we are doing the assignment workshop for Essay 2, and that will conclude theme number 2. Alright guys, so till next time.